Good evening. This is Keisha Rogers with Promethean Action, and we want to thank you for joining our Monday Night Strategic Overview. It is Monday, November 3rd, and there has been just explosive activity going on in the world, and the leadership of President Trump could not be more clear, more apparent, but also couldn't be more clear how freaked out the enemy is, the British globalist forces that have tried to continue to control the United States for the last several decades, centuries. But I think Susan Kokenda shared it and expressed it very well. And if you haven't had a chance to watch her weekly update, she did an update this past Saturday in the aftermath of President Trump's recent trip to Asia and the deals that were made, particularly uh, in China with Xi Jinping, President Trump's visit there. But as she said, Trump took the wrecking ball to 100 years of British geopolitics. You've seen this in terms of what he has established on peace agreements, what he's established with the recent trade agreements in not only China, but across many other countries in Asia. And then also what he has done to put a stop to the ongoing war. And I think the key that Michael, who is back with us this week, is going to be discussing is now, as President Trump made clear in what he did to own the interview that's just a day or so ago with 60 Minutes, and the interview where he made very clear what he has done to revive the United States. That the key right now is getting more people to understand what Trump's policy is. How do we develop a policy for the United States that really harkens everything that President Trump has said and represented? And so I think you're seeing a transformation that's going on in the country amongst young people right now. Michael can speak to this very emphatically as he's going out and talking to young people on a daily basis on the campuses. But I really appreciated what he had to say in his email address that he sent out. The key to this discussion tonight is that we need to establish a vision for our nation and communicate a vision for our nation and communicate what kind of identity is necessary to build that nation and to restore the beauty of our civilization. Trump understands that a lot of young people want to participate in such a national mission and a vision, and we have to stop any opposition to achieving that. So with that, I'd like to hear what Michael has to say on that national mission being put forth and where we are with the leadership of President Trump and just all of the explosive activity that's underway right now.
Okay. Look, there's an old German general named Clausewitz who said, "War is politics by other means." And in reality, we're in a war now, but it's politics is war by other means. And the question is, who are we fighting? What is the war about? Now, too many people might say we're fighting liberals, we're fighting radical left. Certainly that is true in terms of electoral contests, but that's not really the enemy. And the question I think that defines the debate today has come up in the recent last week. Tucker Carlson did an interview with Nick Fuentes, who is the head of an operation called America First. It's oftentimes referenced as the Groypers. It's incredibly popular with people under 30. And there's a lot more I could say about it. Some of you probably know about it. Some of you may not know, or at least you've probably seen the video or seen mentions of it, because it certainly made a lot of waves. What I want to get into tonight is why this entire dynamic between Nick Fuentes and say like Mark Levin, and we'll kind of use those. Nick certainly is kind of filled the vacuum for a younger generation, the anger and outrage that they feel has been done with the immigration levels, the forever wars, the lack of industry, the lack of mission, the feminization of culture. But he's also holds extremely, like, he's very overtly has racial views or racist views. And there's also and then there's Mark Levin on the other side, who is almost the archetypal boomer kind of former Reagan DOJ administrator, a lawyer in the DOJ. I think he was chief of staff to the attorney general, Edward Meese, I think. And, but he's just very typical of this kind of old line boomer view of Israel and America's relationship to Israel. After now, like 25 plus years of incessant warfare in the Middle East, and Israel has become a flashpoint. And this is not something probably news to many of you. It's been a constant reference in different ways. I think it was Marjorie Taylor Greene who reported it on Megyn Kelly at one point. But that under 30, and I've seen this on college campuses, under 30, there's almost no support for Israel. Whether conservative, liberal, radical left, radical right, centrist, non-caring person, apathetic person, there's just really no love or support. There is some. I mean, it's not like it's non-existent, but it's really become a flashpoint. And that's not surprising because some of this is built up over the last 8-9 years. And then, of course, it crescendoed with the war in Gaza. This question of Israel has become the defining question for almost the entire generation of young Americans. And in some ways, it's skewed the entire real political war. It's a part of it. It's not obviously separate from it. Certainly, it's been a big part of policy and foreign policy of the United States, the Middle East generally. So how I'm going to approach this tonight is I don't have it scripted. I'm going to try to define some of these issues, put some context into this debate. But and then we're going to broaden it out to another flashpoint within young people today, a lot of fear. Flashpoint generally for the culture is the ICE and the ICE raids and the immigration enforcement questions. What are we doing in these cities? But I covered that 2 weeks ago somewhat extensively. Like, you have liberals basically today protesting for violence in the cities and against peace abroad. So the anti-war movement, is living up to its name. Ironically, the bigger question is this question of, well, what does it mean to be an American? What does it mean to be America first? What does it mean to make America great? How have past generations built our nation? And how do we bring that quality of American culture, American identity back to the fore? From a Nick Fuentes or Groyper view, there's an intrinsic racial component to that question. To me, that doesn't cut it. There's something far more universal about what it means to be American in terms of what we have to bring to the fore. It doesn't mean you say, well, you've got to have an equal balance of each race and each sex in every company, in every university, in every institution. This has become obscene to say somehow everything has to look like everything else. I mean, what we want suburban plazas for the entire American society? Like, hardly. But it's a different question of principle. Universal principles are at the core of the question of what real American identity is. So that's what I'm going to try to jump into tonight. But of course, the big kind of contest is this question of Israel. And I want to situate that. So what you have in essence is an old game counter game. And there's two aspects to it. One, the enemy, in this case, the globalists, and I'll define that as we go on tonight. But for now, we'll call them the globalists. They intend to destroy Trump's Republican coalition. It's too core to a real political shift. As Keisha referenced, Susan Kokinda did our YouTube video on Saturday, and she started with a quote from Mark Carney, who said, the rules-based international liberal order is basically over. That game is ended. It's done with. We are at a kind of a change as big and as tantamount to the end of the fall of the Berlin Wall the end of the Cold War. So 35 years ago. And I think that's true. And that's certainly what Trump is doing internationally, but it's premised also on what we've talked about here for years, which is this MAGA movement, what eventually became crystallized during the COVID lockdowns, the M3 election process, the fraudulent election, the J6 event, that there was a shift in what it meant, that it was no longer politics, but it was a war, that politics is warfare by other means. We are facing a war for the country. You sitting back and casting a ballot, of kind of handing your ballot over the fence and hoping it works out, and you go back to your normal, so-called normal life, pay your mortgage and watch the game and celebrate Christmas and go on a summer vacation. We're just not in Kansas anymore. We're not in that America. And I think people kind of knew that, but they hadn't confronted the question of responsibility. That same kind of question of responsibility came up with Charlie Kirk and his assassination. For a lot of people, they thought, okay, we've got a youth movement. There were clearly problems with Turning Point in terms of its policy issues. When it started out, it was very libertarian. It had like a Christian Zionist kind of bent, kind of a neocon element to it in its foreign policy. But Charlie was a remarkable guy, and he was changing. He was responding to Trump. It's maybe kind of ironic. Both Charlie Kirk and Nick Fuentes were both Ted Cruz guys. They were both like basically neocons. So, Ted Cruz, for my book, Ted Cruz is basically a neocon. They were neocons before Trump won the primary and then he won the election. But Trump's had a major impact on this entire generation of young people. And Charlie kept changing and developing. And clearly he was killed at a time where he was making big changes in terms of his foreign policy outlook. And it wasn't just Israel. And that's the point I ultimately want to get to, that the change in foreign policy isn't just about Israel. It's about understanding the war as we see it in Promethean action, the way that Lyndon LaRouche, our founder, ultimately saw the political warfare that Trump has once again waged from a truly American standpoint. And so, the way this has emerged, is there is an attempt to eliminate voices out of MAGA. There's an attempt to try to purify the MAGA brand. And those attempts, and this is true within any organization, whether it was the one that I've been working in, or maybe it was a company you're in, but you attempt to basically purge it of people you say are not, loyal enough, pure enough, ideologically consistent enough. Instead of having a mission of accomplishing something in the future and then asking people to contribute to that, and if they don't contribute to that, you hold them accountable for the lack of contribution. You instead go around and say, are you identifying with what we're saying, what we're doing? Are you ideologically conforming to this in the right way? Versus, are you helping to get the mission done? And so that's happens in every political movement. This is basically what probably 85% of all socialist literature seems to be about, is kind of clean out various factions and ideological purity. That's why there were so many different socialist parties. But it happens in any political movement. And MAGA is an insurgency. MAGA is a regime change in the United States. We are fundamentally changing, as Mark Carney said, the rules-based international order run by the Washington consensus. The neocons, the neoliberals, the central banking, the pro-Wall Street, pro-corporation, multinational corporations, emphasis on GDP. Who cares about workers? Who cares about wages? Who cares about quality of life? Who cares about community? And then forever war policies, open borders, cheap labor, corporate profit. I mean, that has been the regime since basically 1970. They kicked Richard Nixon out of the White House um, for basically to accelerate that agenda. They tried to kill Ronald Reagan, and they've obviously tried to basically do everything possible to Donald Trump, and then Kennedy. So in the post-war period, we've had a series of presidents who have attempted to try to challenge that DC Washington consensus, kind of the liberal American empire, where we basically adopt British foreign policy and internally destroy the United States. Those presidents have basically been killed. So they've been killed because they were trying to bring a mission to the country. And that's not acceptable. What you want is so MAGA is attempting to overturn that neoliberal order and to bring a real sense of mission, a real sense of conviction from the broad population. This kind of awakening in 2020 becomes then the bulwark of our insurgency. Donald Trump is certainly the spearhead, but the bulwark was this awakening in 2020 to say, we have to win this. It is an existential question. The gender mutilation questions, the open border questions, the forever war questions, world war, religious war, nuclear war, the hyperinflation, massive money printing, the Green New Scam. I mean, you name it. We had to win it. Let alone just the lockdowns and force the collapse of any sanity in the medical system, whatever. So there's two sides of this ideological conformity. One is, as Mark Levin said at the Republican Jewish Coalition event in Vegas over the weekend, to be pro-American is to be pro-Israeli. And to be pro-Israeli is to be pro-American. And that's MAGA, and that's American patriotism. Now, he'd have a hard time arguing that from the standpoint of any of our greatest presidents, or, from Washington, John Quincy Adams, Abraham Lincoln, who am I thinking of here? William McKinley. Franklin Roosevelt was very clear on the colonial issue. And, the question of the United States does not get involved in alliances. We look to operate off a principle. We'll help nations when they need help. We'll oppose nations when they're problematic. We don't go in search of monsters abroad in search of monsters to destroy, as John Quincy Adams said. So the idea that we somehow have an intrinsic tie to Israel, there's no foundation in American foreign policy. You could argue that since the Cold War, and certainly since the founding, the acknowledgement of Israel by the UN, and the contest of the Cold War, and then, of course, the rise of radical Islam and the terrorists and caliphate, ISIS caliphate, that there's reasons to support Israel. The support of a nation in the context of U.S. interests and the interests of the world is totally fine. It's a question of that we support Israel policy because it's Israel's policy, or we support Israel no matter what their policy is, doesn't really fly and cut it. And a lot of young people have really been forced to reckon with this. And I don't think it's just young people. I think it's a lot of the culture. So Mark Levin is on this side, but he's not just on this side. Like, that's a fine policy. I don't have any problem with that stance. Somebody wants to have that stance and argue for it. It's a free country. You want to say that America is Israel, Israel is America, have at it. But he's been saying now for some time that Tucker Carlson specifically is someone who has to be kicked out and banned and canceled. And they had signs at this event in Vegas that said Tucker Carlson is not MAGA. So there he's defining, and this has been his line. Mark Levin is now the gatekeeper of what it means to be MAGA. And there are others, kind of influencers on the Mark Levin side, who basically have been saying the same thing. We're pro-Trump. Tucker Carlson was critical of Trump because he was about to bomb Iran. And Tucker said, we don't need to bomb Iran. We don't need more wars in the Middle East. Charlie Kirk was saying the same thing. But somehow it applies specifically to Tucker that you have basically turned and become anti-Trump. That's how they looked at it. But it expands now. It's not just Tucker Carlson. It's Steve Bannon. It's Marjorie Taylor Greene. And then it also includes Candace Owens and Nick Fuentes. And I'm putting those two on a completely different. They're outside. But Steve Bannon has been a critical feature in this war. He's oftentimes wrong on things, but the guy is committed. This guy is in a war, and he is committed to try to rebuild the American industry and fight for the working class interest of America. He's pretty overt about that in his fights. And that's it's an important part of what we're doing. Marjorie Taylor Greene is kind of a very impressive congresswoman, not on everything, but her stances on the Ukraine war were remarkable. Given the climate in Washington, just total spine of steel. And then she took a similar stance. She's not anti-Israel. Neither is Tucker, neither is Bannon. But they took a very strong stance that what is Israel doing? How are you saying you're defending Western civilization by the massive destruction and bombing of an area? And Israel justified it. I wrote an article about it. Israel was justifying this as if it was burning, like the firebombing of Dresden, which there were no military-aged men in the city. And yet they just basically incinerated. Allied bombing, British-sponsored Allied bombing, basically incinerated this beautiful East German town. And just killed women and children and the elderly. And the injured, the maimed. And Israel defended that. And of course, it was a war atrocity that should never have happened. A war is hell. And that was civilizational war in World War II. Israel could argue that it was existential war with Hamas. I'm sure they have it, and they certainly did. But it's certainly by no means a defense of Western civilization to justify the absolute destruction of both all the beautiful, the cathedrals go back to the end of the religious wars in the 1600s. Both the Protestant and Catholic cathedral in Dresden came out of that, and they were kind of testaments to a new era after the Peace of Westphalia. And that's a testament to Western civilization, not the massive destruction of that city and those cathedrals. So, nothing I'm saying is really new, but it's at least important, I think, environment to understand this, because it's becoming a very critical question of how do we think about what Donald Trump is actually accomplishing, because this is a remarkable transformation of the global system and of the culture of our country. And we can't let it be pulled off the tracks. We have to keep this thing on the rails. So there were understandable criticisms of Israeli policy. And Trump handled it incredibly well. He's probably the most perfectly situated person to handle that because of the long and strong relationship with Israel. J.D. Vance said that in a cabinet meeting. Trump had decades of relationships with Israelis, with Jews in New York, with businessmen who had close ties to both the United States, New York, and Israel. But he also had very close relationships with a lot of the Arab leaders. And that was really kind of precious to bring this war to an end. Like he said, it would never have happened if he had been president. But the war happened, and it's now raised a deeper question. So you have this Mark Levin, and he's trying to say Marjorie Taylor Greene, Steve Bannon, and Tucker have to be canceled. And he basically called for a war on them. Now, this got heated. The reason Mark Levin escalated his attack this weekend was because Tucker Carlson had Nick Fuentes on his podcast. And there's so much I could say about Fuentes and America First, his organization and the Groypers and the group. But undeniably, and if you haven't watched the interview, it's certainly worth watching to see what's actually being discussed. But there is a level of outrage amongst especially young men in this country that's hard for most people to understand. You go on a date with a girl from a dating app. If you don't like her, she doesn't just like unfriend you. She starts to post things about you, like you tried to sexually harass her or tried to rape her or molest her, or you're vile or whatever. There's entire websites dedicated to just destroying young men. Um, Young men have been called, especially young white men in this country, have been called racist practically since they were born. They walk into a kindergarten or first or second grade. Teachers are talking about race. Kids are talking about race. Kids are calling other kids racist because it's just become the lingo. I mean, we're talking, 10, 12, 14 years ago, the height of the Obama rage baiting environment. And so with tons of immigration coming into the country and kind of an anti-American sentiment increasing from the Democrats and radical left and all the kind of treatments that these young guys have gotten, there's a kind of anger. And to call them racist, to call them anti-Semitic really means nothing. They have heard it their whole lives. What does it matter? You're going to call me a racist no matter what I do. That's a dangerous environment. Our founder and our organization under Lyndon LaRouche was called racist, right-wing, anti-Semitic. And his response was very clear. If you're going to do that to me, they did it to people like Pat Buchanan also. If you're going to do that to me, who's clearly not racist, is a totally universal outlook, and is not anti-Semitic in any way, shape, or form, but is willing to be very critical and straightforward. Of course, the anti-Semitic line is supposed to be, well, he's saying the bankers, but really he means the Jews. Well, it's like, no, we mean the bankers. But this kind of ADL control of the narrative is a deployment to control discussions. And if you do that to good people, eventually you will create the conditions where people that really hold views no longer, these categories mean nothing. And that's what's happened. And that's intended. And what Nick Fuentes has been targeting, I mean, he's had a beef with Tucker Carlson, but the real attack for Nick Fuentes and his group, he doesn't support President Trump anymore. He thinks Trump has pulled back from his America First commitments. He thinks he's become too pro-Israel based on various supporters. Nick Fuentes has been entirely focused that for Fuentes, unlike Levin, where Levin says Israel is just an ally and there are no globalists. Levin is basically a neocon. There are no globalists. It's just American empire that supports Israel. For Fuentes, the globalists are Israel. And Israel is the globalists. They're synonymous. There's no other framework. That's the problem. The problem that Trump's waging, the war we're waging against the globalists, is now Israel. And his target is to character assassinate J.D. Vance. That he's a creature of Palantir. He's a creature of Peter Thiel. Palantir, of course, is run by Alex Karp, who's very pro-Israel. And so it's a targeting of J.D. Vance and threatening even to basically undermine his presidential campaign in the primaries. Now, can that happen? Will that happen? I don't know. But that's certainly the very nature of the discussion. There's an intent to cancel J.D. Vance. And of course, who would replace him? Marco Rubio? I mean, Marco Rubio, he's done a great job as Secretary of State, but he has a neocon past. So what you're getting in replace, there's an attempt, and what I'm trying to describe, and I did it maybe in more detail than maybe was necessary. But what I'm wanting to just paint as a little bit of a picture, because if I just make the references, it may not work, is you have two factions who are attempting to character assassinate, in one case, Tucker Carlson, other case, J.D. Vance, when these are the two people, amongst others, who were clearly the people that would be able to carry Trump's commitments in opposition to the radical left, in opposition to the neocons, in opposition to the globalists, a commitment in some way towards Trump's economic and cultural policies of rebuilding the United States and ending the forever wars? Because that's the question. Ending the forever wars, rebuild the country, and then begin to improve the lives of the American citizens. So now we could debate, are there other people that are better than those two? But I think anybody that isn't seriously in the fight recognizes those two play an important role going forward. And any attempt to character assassinate them and cancel them and say neither of them should be part of the MAGA movement suggests something's off. And what you have is, in essence, a gang counter gang kind of operation. So I think in some sense, I can't confirm this, I think Tucker had Nick Fuentes on to force the issue, to force to say, look, if Mark Levin's going to try to cancel me, let's have the real discussion here. Let's expose the whole real controlled debate, this kind of contrived debate over Israel, because it's not a question of Israel. It's a question of British imperial foreign policy. There's no doubt that AIPAC, the Israeli lobby, and certain Jewish neocons, amongst other neocons and Republicans in MAGA, are whipped up around controlling U.S. foreign policy, largely in the Middle East, based on Israel. That is a globalist policy. It's been a globalist policy, though, to control the Middle East in a kind of constant state of warfare since the end of World War I, or even earlier. I mean, the British foreign policy, the Balfour Declaration by the Rothschild to set up, sponsored by Rothschild to set up Israel and call for a Jewish state in the Levant, was a British foreign policy of control, of divide and conquer in the former Ottoman Empire area. And that's the same policy the United States has been sucked into. The same way we were sucked into during World War II, we supported Ho Chi Minh and a nationalist revolution in Vietnam. In 1945, under Harry Truman and under British foreign policy influences, we supported Japanese prisoners of war retaking Vietnam and holding it until French soldiers could come and occupy Vietnam. We've been sucked into a globalist foreign policy, and Israel is certainly a part of that. The British Anglo-American alliance is not doing very well. A lot has been exposed. The British hands in Russiagate have been increasingly exposed. The French collapse under Macron is blatantly obvious. The direct and overt references to the collapse in Europe that J.D. Vance made at the Munich Security Conference make it very clear Europe does not have the strings of control on U.S. policy it once did. The last vestige of that kind of Anglo-American control of our policy does in some ways is connected to Israel and the Israeli lobby, but it is the globalist networks. It's not the Jews. It's not Israelis. It's a specific aspect of a globalist construct that are running a counter-gang operation to try to destroy MAGA. And this is the biggest problem. In talking to young people in terms of organizing this process, what we've got to get better at is making it clear what the actual enemy is, what the globalists really are. When Peter Navarro went to the Council on Foreign Relations, we covered this. Promethean Action covered this. But much of the rest of the media, including the MAGA influencers, didn't cover it. He goes to the Council on Foreign Relations, Peter Navarro, and calls out explicitly that Trump is ending the reign of multinational corporations. That's a war on the globalists. That's a war on their structure of control. And it's that kind of fight that we have to increasingly be waging. So I think there's no basis to character assassinate Tucker or J.D. Vance or any of the other people really referenced, at least at the core of this. And whether Mark Levin or Fuentes have much to contribute after Israel is no longer the fighting point, the sticking point, is up to them to decide. Can they make actual contributions to pulling together a political coalition that will rebuild the United States and make sure we keep these foreign wars ended? Is up to them. But the idea that somehow they get to play a political football on Israel and to control our policy or control what MAGA is an obscene and obnoxious attempt by people that have no commitment to a real mission, if they're only going to be fixated on that issue of Israel. The other point is that this is a game counter game, because if you have somebody who's overtly racist and somebody who's overtly a neocon, and Nick Fuentes and Mark Levin, and they're both saying they are MAGA definers, they define MAGA, it's very easy for the enemy to then stigmatize MAGA as both racist and neoconservative. When dealing with the questions of ICE and dealing with the questions of violence in the cities has nothing to do with racism or a kind of a brutal neocon dictatorship that Dick Cheney might have dreamed of. It has everything to do with ensuring that the wages of the American people go up and that the safety of our cities, the safety of our streets, that the schools and hospitals and other public facilities are there to meet the interests and needs of our citizens. And that's what the Democrats and their billionaire funders and their globalists don't want to hear. And so you've got a counter gang operation, the attempt to undermine domestic security policies for public safety for our citizens is now considered some kind of right-wing fascist and racist policy. Is it? Or is it just actually the concerns of Black Americans living in inner cities where crime is so rampant that 1 out of every 50 are the victim of a violent crime every year? So this has been the fight that's blown up in the last week, but it's obviously been brewing for some time. And in the vacuum of Charlie Kirk's assassination, Nick Fuentes' crowd, the America First, was already far bigger than many people imagine. I mean, he's captivated a whole generation of young people that are angry and pissed about how they've been basically told they don't matter. We don't need you. We don't need your labor. We don't need you to get married. We don't need your children. We don't need you to participate in society. You're intrinsically problematic. Christianity is intrinsically a racist or violent religion. But in the wake of Charlie Kirk's assassination, he's increasingly been more and more a prominent voice within the younger generation. These things need to be hashed out. The anger and the frustration of the younger generation is not going away. But this comes to then the deeper question and what Trump is accomplishing. I mean, a lot of emphasis for Trump has been on foreign policy. I mean, he's done a lot domestically. He's brought a lot of investments into the United States. He's done a lot on immigration and the violence in Washington, D.C., now Memphis. He's put a lot of focus on Chicago. We need a lot more focus on our country, though. And there can be a sense that, why are things taking so long? Now, they've been moving so quickly, but the people out there are hurting bad. And the polling somewhat shows that the polls, you never really know. But people are not doing well in this country. There's a lot of anger and frustration. And the young people feel like they've been born into this. And they really, there's a lot of frustration. And that's why Mamdani, this was Charlie Kirk's last speech to interview with Tucker Carlson. Mamdani's just the beginning. I mean, this is a guy that's promising, publicly government-run grocery stores and free bus rides and free healthcare and free education and rent control. And it all sounds great, but it's such an insane utopia. Even Saturday Night Live had to expose the fact that this guy can't possibly deliver on everything he's saying. And of course, he's backed by a bunch of billionaires. It's just a typical intelligence operation. Basically kind of cotton candy politics. Just give them all the fluff they could possibly imagine. You can't help but buy it. But ultimately, can't deliver on anything. Trump is really delivering. but he's delivering on the big questions of the global economic structure, on the entire trade system, on how the financial system is organized, on how we can direct credit into the United States, largely from overseas investors, but increasingly building up national wealth funds, some type of direct credit by the government into major large-scale infrastructure projects, energy infrastructure, really beginning to rebuild the country to where we really have a major labor shortage, that you will really need vocational labor. Like starting electricians are making $60 an hour because we just have to rebuild the country. And so people stop leaving the stockbrokering offices. They drop out of college, and the young guys go and get training as an electrician because we're a plumber or as, in cement pouring and whatever, because we're going to start building the country and we need people that know these productive skills. That's the kind of process we've got to get to. And it comes to then a question of what does it mean to be an American? We have an article up by Robert Ingram on the Erie Canal. Projects that are unparalleled in the world. Projects that are going to fundamentally transform our country. Projects that are going to fundamentally transform the way we operate in the universe, like the space program, the landing on the moon, building a lunar base today, exploring Mars, exploring the galaxy more broadly, building large-scale projects in the United States. This is how we recruited people to America in the past. Lincoln recognized this with the railroad project. He knew, even while the war was going on, we've got to continue. And he was a big railroad guy. So he knew that even after the Civil War, so during it, he was already planning how we build the railroad so that we could actually begin to fulfill the continental destiny of the country. Once the war was over, we could actually get to building it. There's a quality of universality in that we can launch great missions, but it wasn't by a military dictatorship of Stalin or Mao or, the Chinese regime today, where the nation's going to do this, you really don't have a say in it, or by a monarchy in Europe in the past, but that by a process of self-government, we chose to create a culture that launched great missions. We chose political leadership that would serve temporarily to launch and initiate great missions that successive leaders would have to fulfill. Like what Ulysses S. Grant or William McKinley do in following what Lincoln starts. And that Lincoln looked to John Quincy Adams and to Hamilton and to Washington as what he was attempting to accomplish. That he knew he was attempting to fulfill that great project that had been started. We've got to get back to building the country. We've got to bring back that kind of universal approach. And we have to draw out the talents of people that are capable and willing to build that kind of country. This is a question of warfare. Politics is war by other means. Yes, there's all kinds of fights taking place within MAGA, political fights within the country. There's all kinds of mainstream media fixations on the government shutdown. But the real question is, are we going to wage war on the globalists, not by simply reorganizing the entire global structure? Trump has practically already done that. It's not completed, but he's torn down the old edifice and he is rebuilding a new one. The question is, are we going to continue to fight specifically for the young people today who are looking at the various political options and they don't see the aggressive kinds of action that are necessary? They're looking to see a full-scale mobilization of the country. They're looking for a nation that demands their talents, that demands their capability, that demands their strengths, demands that they improve what they're capable of doing because the nation and civilization and creation need them. The fixation on Israel, the fixation on any other kind of point is meant to be a distraction. from the fact that what any nation does when it functions effectively, and ours by far is to function more effectively than any other, is to give an individual that sense of participating in God's creation. Because a territory in an empire doesn't do that. A region governed by an imperial, prince or governor doesn't function that way. Rome was essentially a fascist system. Napoleon was a modern fascist. The question of a nation state is that it's based on the individual, not based on an ideology. It's not based on a coherent ideology. That is expecting religious fealty. That's not the freedom of religion. Ours is to say that we're going to bring the concept of God that Christ and the Christian culture reveal and make it real as a direct application of American culture. That it is a universal identity accessible to any person that wishes to adopt it and to take it into their heart, that they're going to participate in this kind of mission in what is ultimately the mission of God's creation. That is the mission of the United States. And that it to be fruitful and multiply. And to do it not by imposition, but to do it by free will and self-government. And that ultimately we would hope that other nations would come to have the ability to have that same capability. But this is the mission. This is what Trump's actions, what Trump has made available. And I would probably agree that too many people are not trusting what Trump's doing enough. But we also have to push the issue. But we push the issue on the big questions. We keep rallying people to the cause of war. And that war is to rebuild this country, to make it once again that shining city on a hill. That, to me, is the mission. And I think Donald Trump fully agrees that is to make America once again that shining city on a hill. And then we play that leadership role. And we've given our young people the future they deserve and the future they can build, because ultimately they have to build. That's always the point. You always have to build your future. And I think this is the question that's been neglected too much for the younger generation. And this Israel question, or ICE, has been a counter-gang operation that controls a lot of the identity. So hopefully that what I went through tonight was useful. It's a very real question. It may not seem real in your life, what you're consumed with in terms of the political discussion, but it is certainly what is a dominant political culture within the younger generation. And in some sense, what is deflecting from what Trump is actually accomplishing. Like the Epstein situation. I mean, Epstein was a bad guy. And they know 20 of the perpetrators. They named one of them. Thomas Massey named John Paulson. Pretty creepy guy on Wall Street. Probably there was a reason why he wasn't in Trump's administration, because they knew. I mean, it's some nasty people at high-level positions who are caught up. This goes back to 2006, 7, 8. And Epstein was probably a part of the Mossad. Ghislaine Maxwell's father was part of the Mossad and MI6. And connected probably to U.S. intelligence, because we were totally dominated by the globalists for like 40 to 60 years. But the question is, for any of them, for Tucker, for JD, for Mark Levin, for Nick Fuentes, are you willing to get involved and fight to the mission of the country? Or are you going to sit there and say, you're not MAGA, you're not MAGA, you're not real enough, you're not hard enough, you're not committed enough on whatever their issue is? Or are you actually committed to rebuilding the country? And this is probably where Charlie Kirk was such a threat. Because Charlie looked to unify and bring the whole process together. He was committed to rebuilding the country. He was captivated by the kind of profoundly Christian message that this crazy business guy from New York brought to American politics. If we're going to rebuild the country, get the hell out of the way. Stop giving me your reasons of why you won't fight. well, we're Christians and we don't fight. Get the hell out of the way. We've got to fight for the country now. And we're going to fight for it. We're going to rebuild it. And Charlie was captivated by it. He was changing. And that's a threat. And Tucker will be even under more scrutiny. Anyone will be. Any of the people I mentioned would be under more scrutiny if they increasingly adopted a more optimistic view of what we're going to accomplish and their undying commitment to make sure it's accomplished, or that they're going to have to kill them to stop them from trying. You know, a lot of people give advice to these young people. J.D. Vance, Tucker, a lot of people talking to young people, Nick Fuentes. I mean, everybody's trying to capture the younger generation today. And the general advice to them, especially the conservatives, is, well, get married, have children, work hard, get a job, go to church, take your children to church. It's all good stuff. But is it the hardest thing to do? Are we really at a point where we're telling people in the middle of a political war for the existential fight for the existence of the United States, that in the course of that war, go have a family? That's the most important thing you can do. Does it really resonate with the crisis we're in? Jobs are not easy to find. I mean, you can if you go become an electrician or a plumber, but if every guy goes and becomes an electrician or a plumber, there won't be enough of them. There won't be enough jobs. Not right now. I mean, don't we need to call upon our young people to become saints? People that are totally devoted to God, to truth, and to the sacred above all else, and to fully dedicate their life to that. I mean, isn't that what Washington dedicated his life to? He never had children of his own. He married Martha and she had kids. I mean, it comes down to it. Are we really in a war for the country? And if we are, what kind of dedication, what kind of courage, what kind of sacrifice are we willing to ask people to make for the rebuilding of the country? For not letting this moment, because if you haven't gotten it, what I'm saying is that we have a remarkable moment that Trump has given us, but there are clear threats and risks for it to go off the rails. Because some people maybe lack clarity. Other people have agendas of their own, self-serving agendas. And some people don't have the right courage or sense of mission. But we can solve that. We can ask young people to become the most courageous, the greatest generation. Because World War II, it wasn't a draft. I mean, people went and signed up. But it was a building tension. This is something that these kids are going to have to rebuild our country. They're going to have to get in the fight and rebuild this country. And I think they've expressed the talents and capability. There is that quality of leadership amongst them. But this is the question facing us today. And it's going to be the decisive factor, because the ability to capture what this movement really is about is going to determine our ability to fundamentally change the regime in 26 and in 28, and to kill this entire globalist, radical left, anti-Christian, anti-American agenda, to kill it, and to force people to have to come to terms with the principles that are at the foundation of the country, and to have a political discussion within the context of those principles, and nothing else, to no longer tolerate all of the other mishigas that dominates this political discussion today. But we are at a critically decisive point, and it's going to require political candidates and political activists like people on this call to kind of rally this quality of discussion. So it's a near and dear question to my heart. I think it's really important that we give the younger generation a chance to participate and shape and share this discussion of the fate of the country, and to listen to what their concerns are, but also be prepared to understand the political context of how these operations or discussions are occurring. Because our country really does depend on it. I mean, this is what life warfare, politics is. Do people know why they're fighting? when people came to Valley Forge while the soldiers were starving, people came there because they knew why they were fighting. And they were, even if they didn't know how bad the sacrifice might be, they were willing to come to Valley Forge in the middle of winter and join the fight. Why we fight, why people understand the nature of the fight, what we're actually attempting to accomplish and do, and that what the principles of our civilization that we're reviving are, that they're universal to the nature of man made in the image of God. Then that question becomes, something we can't compromise on. And it's a way to secure real victory, because the enemy is panicked and desperate. And that's why these operations are taking place. So anyways, I probably should stop rambling. And we've already got one hand up for a while, Keisha, so we can find out what they're thinking. And if the rest of you want to raise hands and contribute thoughts and ideas to this process, I think we both would like to hear. So I'll leave it there.